So as we've seen from the sessions, the exhibitions and so on, this conference has been a really rich exploration of how data science and AI can be used to solve the most pressing issues home and around the world. The host is the Alan Turing Institute, and you obviously are at the top. And it's the National Institute for Data Science and AI. So you're here, you're at the top. We want to hear from you about your new strategy, which is called Changing the World for the Better with Data Science and AI. So first of all, Adrian, I want you to kick off. You're the Director and Chief Executive. Can you tell us what this strategy is all about, please?
Okay, well, let me sort of wind the clock back slightly. The Alan Turing Institute was originally created as a data science institute, and further along the line, artificial intelligence was added to our title. And it was really the response to a realization that, of course, we've always had data, we've always played with data, learned things with data, so what's different? It was the sheer scale of data that was available, coupled with growth in computer power, that enabled us actually to think differently, to explore differently, to get different insights from data for decision-making, policy-making, changing the world for the better. So that was really the beginning of Turing. We really had three components to what we did. You know, how does this stuff enable us to get further insights? The research agenda in terms of big data, data science, and AI. But this is a sort of new kid on the block. So do we have the people and the skills to do all this? So research, one kind of dimension, people and skills, another dimension. And a third thing that was in the back of our minds was the experience we had with things like GM crops and MMR, where science had produced something that should have been fundamentally positive, but there was a public reaction against it. And so in some sense, managing public awareness, public engagement was the third strand to what we set out to do. So there's a certain sense in which those strands remain, but the world has moved on. You can't listen to a radio program or open a paper at the moment without chatbots chatting at you and shouting at you. And so there's a lot of excitement, but also a lot of concern. We've also had the protein folding algorithms. So the world has moved on, and it was time for us as a National Institute to take stock and say, where do we go from here? Where can we uniquely add value? Because there's a lot of stuff going on out there in the ecosystem. And so what we're doing is we are focusing on three big challenge areas that I think everybody would recognize that the world is really concerned about. Defense and security, health, medicine, and the environment and sustainability. But in addition to that, there is the effect of digitization on society in general, the effect on businesses, the effect on potential policy. So there's a whole raft of stuff which is to do with finance, it's to do with measuring the economy, and somewhere along the line we have to get the social dimension, talking about standards, regulation, ethics, and melding that in. So we have the three big challenge areas that we will focus on, but coupled with the background of thinking about standards and ethics and regulation. So in some sense, the dimensions are the same. This is an evolution, but it's a focus. And also we're taking stock of where Turing adds value in the ecosystem. We've got universities, we've got research institutes. Where do we add value? And that's to do with the really big challenges, the challenges of scale, areas where we need trusted spaces to get hold of the data, and ultimately to see pull through to policy. So that's really our agenda. We have a lot of strategic partnerships with businesses, with government organizations, and fundamentally with the university system. So we did start off with a small number of university partners. One of the other major ingredients in our new strategy will be the Turing University Network, where we will have 35, 40 institutions where we can draw upon, convene, and broker the very best academic expertise in the country. So that, in a nutshell, is where we've come from and the focus of where we're going.
Thanks, Adrian. Doug, you're chair of the Board of Trustees. What's your perspective? Yes.
Thank you very much. Well, look, if I could just say a few words just to amplify some of the points Adrian made. I mean, first of all, I'm absolutely certain that when we come to look back and write the history of the early 21st century, we know that data science, informatics, AI, it will have been the transformative technology. So it's an amazing moment. We're privileged to live through one of those moments when there is a tense, it's happened 3 or 4 times in the last 3 or 4 centuries, and we're in the middle of one. I think that's really cool. To that point, as Adrian and the team were thinking about the strategy, I think there were probably 3 words that for me sort of capture where we were trying to go: focus, additionality, and impact. And if I take those in turns, focus, as Adrian said, you could apply this anywhere, but actually really important for the Institute to pick a couple of really important domains where we know it matters, we have high levels of conviction that data science and AI will have a transformative impact, and also one where we genuinely think the UK has a role to play because we have unique assets or privileged data sets. And that took us to, as you heard, took us to the domains of healthcare, took us to the domains of the environment, took us to obviously defense and national security. So there's a real focus around those sort of research areas. And additionality, as you heard from Adrian, we are privileged to sit in an extraordinary rich ecosystem here. We have amazing university departments, many represented today. We have brilliant companies. We have great sort of, institutes and organizations. So what can the Turing do that adds value above and beyond that? And really that means taking the hard problems and using that convening power to get together what we need. And we know to make progress, you've got to knit together the best data sets in a safe way. You need the best data scientists, you also need the best domain experts, and you need the compute power, the data wrangling. And I think part of Turing's role is to actually take those hardest problems and bring it all together. And then finally on impact, look, in very simple terms, these are big areas. Now, the point about hard problems and grand challenges is you're not guaranteed to succeed. But just think about the prize. Keep your nation safe. Improve healthcare outcomes globally. And solve the biodiversity and climate crisis. I'm pretty excited about that. I hope you are. And if we can pull even a little bit of that off, I think it'll be worth it.
That's great. Thanks for setting out the scene. I just want to spend the next few minutes asking you a few questions, interrogating you a little bit on the strategy and how it works in practice, because it's lovely to have these visions written down. But give us an idea, for example, with one of the grand challenges. You talked about health, environment and defence. So let's take any one of those. Walk us through how it's going to look and work.
Yeah, well, why don't I take one in healthcare? Because that's something I hope we can all relate to. There's an enormous amount of brilliant work going on in healthcare, amazing amounts of research in our universities, fantastic new technologies coming along. But a good example of a grand challenge there would be what we call polypharmacy. So what does polypharmacy mean? So if you think about medicines, I think the UK spent just about £42 billion on medicines last year. So that's an enormous amount of money. And yet think about how we test medicines. We tend to take a new drug. We're worried about safety and efficacy. We do a very expensive, thorough controlled trial, and we either do or don't decide that this one drug is fine to launch onto the market. Now think about the practical reality of Mrs. Jones leaving hospital. Your average patient walks out of hospital with 2.5 bags of drugs. And we haven't got the faintest idea how they work with each other and interact. And it's almost an unsolved problem, it's so hard. And yet, because you've got individual prescriptions at the GP, at the trust level, you've got what Chris Holmes, our expert, would describe as, hundreds of thousands of natural experiments out there. So actually, to really take a hard look at this question of how do different drugs interact with each other in a real-world setting requires bringing together amazing data sets across both primary and secondary healthcare, doing it in a trusted environment. And yet, if you can do it, our health professionals will tell you they are convinced we can improve healthcare outcomes because we have no idea how these things are really interacting. And we can almost certainly do it in a way that significantly cuts the cost, and that money can be reinvested in more doctors, more nurses. So for me, that's a great example of a really hard challenge that can only be solved if we bring all of those pieces together.
With defence, I'm thinking, if you look at the bigger picture, things like geopolitics is complicated. AI is a huge space. How does that sort of leave the Turing Institute in terms of what you can do and how you're positioning yourself?
So perhaps what we haven't emphasised enough, of course, is our interaction with the rest of the ecosystem and other players. So in defence and security, we have the national agencies. And we work closely with the agencies. They are strategic partners. And so that on the one hand, make sure we're defining the problems appropriately, because perhaps you and I don't know exactly what we should be doing in counterterrorism or the rest. And we have access to data that you can't put out there in the public domain or you can't give to an individual academic. And so the data issues, working with the agencies who are close to the coalface, that's a great exemplar of how we work at scale in the national interest.
Okay. How are you going to put the resources behind this strategy? It's very ambitious. Have you got the resources to do it? And if you don't, how will you get them?
Well, that's why the minister is sitting in the front row. I think his checkbook is sticking out of his pocket as we speak. So some of this we have to make our case and argue, and we need to win it more often than we're winning it, perhaps at the moment. But we also do have income streams from those other strategic partners and agencies. But let's not be in any doubt. If you take something like the chatbot and the BARD, and you were to decide that you perhaps wanted national sovereign ownership of something like that, we are talking many hundreds of millions here.
Yeah, yeah.
And we have to recognize that as a nation, and if we're going to be in the game, we have to spend the money.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And look, it's to some extent it's case by case. You know, if you think about who is the natural, if I can use the expression, customer for something like the healthcare things, clearly that's a conversation whereby, look, for a relatively modest investment here, genuinely relatively modest, single-digit millions, you could potentially get a billions outcome. That's almost a no-brainer if you come up with a compelling story. And then, as Adrian says, there are then what you might describe as the really big infrastructure questions about, do we need to invest in a sovereign national capability, particularly for some of the perhaps defence and national security applications where you wouldn't want to, you certainly don't want to contract that out to where you don't have complete control of the environment.
Yes,
So,
we've certainly
But there are
seen-
interesting issues about UK national positioning. I mean, it's not just in AI, it's more generally in science and so on. But I think the creation, one encouraging thing, the creation of the new Department for Science, Technology and Innovation actually gives us a sort of one-stop shop for the conversation. So I'm optimistic.
So do you see, this is a question I guess I'm very intrigued to know the answer to. So do you see AI as a form of soft power, hard power, any power at all?
Golly, what an interesting question. I mean, Adrian, I'm sure you'll have views on this. For me, I come back to that phrase, it's a transformative technology. It's a new toolkit. It's an interesting toolkit because it is that triage of you need data sets, compute power, and brilliant people in the algorithms. I think actually once you've got it and deployed it, there's absolutely the possibility to say, let's just say, for example, we come with transformative breakthroughs on early prediction of cancer or cardiovascular or some of the digital twin examples you saw out there. You know, that's stuff we will do here in the UK that everybody in the world will want and will care about. Now, whether you translate that into soft power or hard power through sort of income or cash, I don't care. But you know, it's a great example of what the department was set up to do, which is, you know, the UK will succeed because we do cutting edge science, and this has to be one of the areas we invest in.
But going back to that other dimension, if you like, the social and policy dimension, you know, if people are going to trade stuff that's based on AI algorithms, ultimately there will be standards and regulation. And the UK actually has a natural advantage there in terms of reputation, let's say, in law and in finance, as a safe place that understands standards and regulations. So I think there's an opportunity there in addition to the tech opportunity.
Okay. So I'm just trying to think, this is your constituency really, isn't it? These are your people. What is your message to them? What does it mean for them? What should they be going away and doing differently as a result of this strategy? How do they need to shift their mindset, what they do, who they work with, how they think?
So I think it's multidimensional, isn't it? The starting point, as Doug said, this is transformative technology. You can't undo it. You can't wind the clock back. It's going to exist. It's going to do all sorts of things. It's going to change businesses. It's going to change jobs. That will have differential impacts on different bits of this audience. But we do need much more of a citizen kind of debate about where all this stuff is going and how we handle it. And so I think that's a universal. What the impact on individuals will be different, but including us.
Yeah, and look, if there's one simple message, it's get involved. I mean, thank you for coming here today. I think that's awesome. I think that's fantastic. I think, you know, this is the place to be. It's the space to be. Hopefully what we can do is create the right conditions and environment to really get after some big, interesting, important questions. But as I hope we explained earlier, that's not something we're going to try and do on our own. That's about using the convening power, getting the best brain power, the best expertise, the best of our wonderful sort of cutting-edge technology companies all together. And if we get that alliance together, I think we can really make a difference. So yeah, get involved.
Thank you. And that is the perfect note in which to thank you for your contributions. Please thank our panellists.
Thank you so much. Thank you.